Hello, did you know I have a Gumroad page where I'm selling a bunch of filters? If not, check it out, links in the description. I also have a Patreon where you can get them at a discounted rate and support the channel. Thank you. Welcome to another show, I'm Sid, and in today's video I'll be breaking down one of the templates that you can find when you create a new project in Spark AR Studio. What I'll be talking about today is the eye color template, which you can find down here. Although if you enjoy the video, leave a like, let me know in the comments, and I might consider expanding it to cover some of the other ones that you see here. I've seen other creators make videos trying to explain how people can use these templates, but I've never specifically seen anyone break them down and explain how the patches interact with one another and the assets and the elements of the scene to create the effect that you can then use as a jumping off point. So I thought the eye color one would be a nice place to start. I've already made a few videos about eyeball effects in the past, and I want to make a few more in the future. So I was thinking I could start there. If we open up the project, then what you'll see here is the eye color block and the block that's connected to it down here, which we can edit as you see here. There are also some materials and the device itself with all the elements nested inside of it. You can drop those down and you can see how they interact with one another inside of the patch editor here. There's a little bit going on, but nothing too complicated. So what I basically want to do is explain how all of this stuff works, how it interacts, and demonstrate how you can recreate this in a new blank project to basically further your own effects without having to rely on these templates, which may eventually become deprecated or removed from the template library. This might also give you an insight into how blocks work, which is something I rarely use myself, but they come up quite often in these templates and they have pretty cool functionality. So as I'm figuring them out, I'm realizing that I should probably start using them more in my own projects as well. So yeah, basically that's everything that this video will be. I'm probably going to lose this camera now in the bottom left corner just so that you can see more clearly what's going on. And yeah, we'll jump straight into the video. Okay, so the first thing I'm going to do is explain how the template actually works. I'll go through each of the elements in the scene, the assets that are used, including this 3D eyeball, which you can get from the Spark AR library, the materials, and then we'll talk about the block itself. So the main block is down here, which we can edit properties for by clicking this button, which will open up a completely separate page. As you can see, with even more patches and more interactions inside of this block root. Those are the inputs and outputs that you see inside of this patch editor. This eye color block up here is the same one but dragged inside of the scene so that we can actually interact with it and make changes like color and scale and opacity and things like that. So it all fits together quite easily, and it's not as complicated as it may seem, but once you get the hang of it and you kind of understand how these things work at a basic level, then you will be able to recreate this in a new project, which is what we're going to do right now. Okay, so here we are in a new blank project, and the first thing I like to do is pause it when the eyes are pretty wide, and then switch over to 2D perspective and zoom all the way in so that we can see clearly what we're working with. Next thing I'm going to do is view show the patch editor, just because we'll be using it later, so it's worth having it open now. And I'm also going to import the 3D object for the eyeball that we'll be using. So if you hit library here, under 3D objects, 3D shapes, and then select from the drop down menu eyeball. Import this into your scene. As you can see here, this asset is used with the eyeball shader and the eyeball patch to track the direction of someone's eyes. So what I'm also going to do is come under patch assets, and just to be quick, I'll type in eyeball, which should bring up the eyeball shader, and we'll be using that to create the effects of the actual iris and the sclera and change the color and things like that. Those are our inputs, so we're going to have to create a block that connects up with that, but for now we'll just import that into our project as well, and you'll see all of those are now in the assets panel here. We have our eyeball here, which is a 3D object with its own material. We also have a default environment texture, which we can replace or even delete if we don't want to use it. And then in this patches folder we now have the eyeball shader patch. So now we have the basics set up down here. We want to start creating a few elements in our scene. So there's actually going to be two layers for this. So if you come up here to the scene and then select the layers tab, what we can do is rename this layer to be our main layer. And then we're going to add a second one, which we're going to use just for the face occlusion. So we'll call this face occluder layer. And we drag that one underneath because the order of your layers is quite important. This pink one here is actually the top layer, so it will appear on top of everything else that we create. So the occluder will cover everything else and make it so that you can only see the iris parts of what we're creating and not the rest of the mesh and anything else that we're adding underneath. Once we have that, go back to your scene. We're going to add an object now, and we're going to select face tracker from the scene understanding menu. Once we have that, we're going to drag it up above these ambient and directional lights, but still nested inside of our focal distance here. So you see the hierarchy. This device, camera, focal distance, and then we have our face tracker. So now we're going to take the ambient light and the directional light and drag those inside of the face tracker so that everything we create from now on will be nested inside of this object. I'm also going to delete the default environment texture down here because we don't actually need it. It's included whenever you import this eyeball model from the Spark AR library, but it's not a part of the template. So just to keep things simple, I'll delete that as well. Now we're going to add some meshes. So select your face tracker, right click and add, and we're going to add a face mesh. You can do that again to add a second one, or you can right click the face mesh and duplicate. The shortcut for that will be next to it. On a Mac it's Command D. I'm not sure what it is for Windows, but we're going to duplicate that so that we have two face meshes. One of them I'm going to drag above the ambient light, and one of them I'm going to drag above the directional light, which will act as our order of operations in terms of layers until we assign them in the properties menu over here. So for this top mesh here, what I'm going to do is change the layer from main layer to face occluder layer, and I'm going to leave the rest of it on the main layer. So everything else can stay the way it is. But this one here is going to be our occluder mesh. In the template, it's just named Face Mesh 0, but for the purposes of this tutorial, I'll be renaming it Face Mesh Occluder. You can name it anything you like as long as you're consistent and it's easy to keep track of everything that you have in your scene and in your assets panel. This mesh down here, we're going to be using to add a retouch at the end. So I'm going to name this one Face Mesh Retouch. And again, just leave that on the main layer. There's no need to change it. The only one you need to change is the occluder, which is now on our occluder layer. One quick thing to note, and it's not actually that important, but this directional light here shouldn't be nested inside of the face tracker. That was my mistake. You could try and drag it out, but you'll have a little bit of trouble with that. As you see, it doesn't quite go where you want it to. The quickest way to do it is to drag it above the face tracker and then drag the face tracker above that. So now our order of operations is all of this with the face tracker nested inside of it. We have our face mesh occluder, our ambient light, our face mesh retouch, and then outside of that, as its own thing, but still nested inside of the focal distance, we have the directional light. Like I say, it's not too important, but that was my mistake. And if you compare this with the template, you will notice the difference. So I just wanted to point it out as I noticed it. Now we're going to add some materials to our face mesh. The first one is this occluder, so select it, add material, create new material, and then we're going to rename that to face mesh occluder. You can leave it at standard shader type, and you don't have to change any of these settings other than the opacity, which we're going to drop down to 0%. Now for the second mesh, we're going to add a new material, create new material, rename it to face mesh retouch, and then change the shader type on this one from standard to retouching. As you can see, it's now projecting our original camera texture onto this mesh. The skin smoothing is by default set at 50%, but if you drop that down to around 25%, that's the same as the template. You can play around with this yourself. If I make this slightly larger, then you'll see the effect that it has of smoothing out the skin and removing some of those details. This is just a cosmetic thing and isn't actually necessary for the eyeball template, but they've added it in here, so I thought I would show you how to include that as well. Now we're going to add our eyeball, so select it in the assets panel and drag it into your scene, nest it inside your face tracker and underneath the ambient light. For me, it won't immediately go under ambient light, instead it goes under this face mesh retouch, so just drag it above there, and then what we're going to do is Command D to duplicate it, so that now we have two eyes. You want to rename the first one left eyeball, and the second one right eyeball. What I'm actually going to do now is delete the eyeball material that came included with the 3D object, so select that and just delete it from your assets panel. And after that, drop down both the left and the right eyeball. If you look in the properties tab here, you'll see that the left eyeball is a 3D object instance, same with the right one, and then this object inside of it is actually the mesh, and that's where we're going to be creating our new material. So select one, create a new material, we'll rename that to be eyeball material, and now select the other eyeball that you didn't already create a material for, and just apply your eyeball material to that one as well. Now we're going to come down here to this material that we've created, and we're going to make a few adjustments here just to mimic the effects from the template. Okay, so we're going to leave the shader type as standard, but we're going to check this box here for specular, which as you can see immediately creates this reflective glow on our object. We're going to change the type from texture to color, which defaults to this weird pink purple color. I'm not sure why, but it gives a nice sense of what's going on. Now we can increase and decrease the smoothness, and what you'll see is that increases and decreases essentially the radius of this glow. The Spark AR template for the eye color is set at 90, which is around here, and the color is defaulted to white, although you can change that and make it anything you like. What this does is it creates an effect similar to the glassy look that you actually get in a real eye, and gives the final 3D object a more realistic look. We're also going to check this box for emission, which basically creates a glow around the entire object. By default it's set to black, which allows no glow at all, but if we switch it all the way to white, you'll see it's glowing pretty much as if there was no texture there at all. You can set it somewhere in between and create kind of interesting effects with it, but we'll leave it at black, which gives this nice drop shadow and is a pretty basic effect. Okay, so now it's time to get our eyeballs in place, because there are actually 2 of them here, but they're in the exact same coordinates, so it looks as though there's only 1 right now. So what we're going to do to get them in the right places where our eyes should be is, first of all, take the face tracker that we have here and drag it inside of your patch editor. What that will do is create these patches here. The first one is a face finder that will track the face in the scene, as you can see here. Then it has a face select, which connects up to it, and that outputs to the face tracker itself. From here, you want to drag out from the face output and add an eyeball shader patch. So double tap and type in eyeball, and that will create this patch for you. So now we have this little setup. Just make it tidier, drag things a little bit closer together. And the outputs from here, as you can see, are left iris, left eyeball center, left eyeball rotation, and then the same thing for the right eyes. So now we're going to come up here to our left eyeball, the 3D object, not the mesh nested inside of it. And we're going to select the position and rotation to create patches for those. So now we'll drag those into place, giving ourselves a little bit of space. And we're going to connect the left eyeball center to the position here. And we're going to connect the left eyeball rotation to this rotation patch. Drag them into the right order, make sure everything's organized in a way that makes sense to you. And as you can see now, this is positioned over the left eyeball. There's also this occluder mesh sitting in front of it, which is why you can't see the whole thing. And now we're going to do the exact same thing for the right eyeball. So position and rotation, drag them into place, and then connect the right eyeball position here and the right eyeball rotation here. So what I'm going to do now is press play, and you'll be able to see the effect in action. It's not perfect just yet, there's still a little bit of work that needs to be done, but you get the gist of what's happening. We have the face occluder covering up most of the eyeball, and the rest of it that's being tracked onto the actual eye is in the right place. So now we add textures to it, it will recreate the look of an iris with an eyeball and a sclera and a pupil and all of those things that we're going to create inside of a block. So I'll just pause that in a good place there, pause that right there, and we'll carry on. So next up we're going to move the mesh forward slightly, which we could do manually by coming into the position here and just adjusting the z-axis. Moving it forward, all that does is cover the eyeball a little bit more that we've created, so that there's less of this bleed around the edge that you might see more when it's moving than when it's still. So what we're going to do is double tap in the patch editor and add a value patch. By default it's set as a number, but if we click that, we can change it here to a vector 3, which is what we want because the position transformation is an x, y, z coordinates vector 3 transformation. So once we've got our value patch here, we want to come up, make sure our face mesh is selected, and then choose position and make a patch out of that. So now we can have that in here. We'll move both of them just out of the way slightly to give myself a little bit more space. And now what we're going to do is connect that up and adjust this to the same as the template, which is 0.002, which will bring this mesh slightly more forwards. You can play around with this and adjust the value yourself, but 0.002 seems to be the one that works the best. So if I hit play now, then you'll see that it's slightly more behind, or the eyeball, sorry, is slightly more behind the mesh. And if I undo it, then you see it comes back slightly forwards. And if I redo it, it's a very small difference, but it does make things look a little bit cleaner, especially once we start adding more details to the eyeball. So now I'll just pause that again and we can carry on. Okay, so now we're going to move on to the final part of this tutorial, which is to add the block element so that we can texture the eyeball and give it the details that are adjustable inside of the template. So the opacity, the iris, the sclera, changing the colors, all of that sort of stuff, which you could do manually inside of this project, but the purpose of a block is to create those elements in a way that can be easily saved and imported into multiple projects without having to recreate those same elements over and over again. It's actually pretty handy, and the more familiar I become with it, the more likely I am to use it in my own projects. So what we're going to do is add an asset, and we're going to select block from the drop down menu. Once you have that, you can select it and hit edit up here in the properties menu to edit the actual file. As you can see, it's pretty similar to a normal Spark AR project, but the first thing that will stand out is the lack of a camera and the lack of elements in the scene other than this block root here. We can select that and you'll see it has inputs, outputs, interactions that we can create patches. You can transform the position and the scale and the rotation, but right now there are no inputs or outputs, so there's nothing to edit. I can even open up the patch editor in here and we can add patches, so I can double tap here and we could add anything we wanted. But for now we'll leave that blank and we'll start with the block root. So at its core, a block is essentially a small Spark AR project which you can import into any other project as basically an automated effect. So the tutorials that you might be able to find on the Spark AR website include things like particle effects for snow or face meshes that change color, things like that. And it's kind of there so that you don't have to keep repeating the same patch structures and setups over and over again. At first, this process might seem a little convoluted, especially with the amount of setup required up front, but once you have it set up, you can export this block and re-import it into any other project without having to repeat the same steps again. So you'll be saving yourself a lot of time in the long run by learning how to create this interoperability between the blocks and your main projects. Okay, so what I'm going to do first is come back over to our main project and take the eyeball shader patch that we added at the very start of this tutorial, drag that into our patch editor, and you'll see all of the elements that we can edit, including the color, the folds, the opacity, everything that you saw in the template at the very beginning. Now I'm going to take the eyeball material that we created and add it in as a diffuse texture. Now if I connect this output to this input, then you'll see the eyeball textures appear and we can edit them manually inside of this patch. So we can change the color of the irises, we can change the pupils, we can increase the pupil opacity. It's pretty much everything that you would want from the template, but done manually. What we're going to do now though is try to automate some of those features with blocks. So if we take the block that we've created down here and we drag it into our scene, at first it will appear under this directional light, but if we drag it even outside of that, to create its own entity. Now we can take this block that's in our scene, drag it into the patch editor, and it will create this. Unfortunately right now we only have a single output named object, which doesn't connect up with any of these inputs on our eyeball shader. So we're going to have to add a few outputs to this block before we can connect it up and automate some of these features. To do that, we're going to come back over now to our block file, and we're going to make sure our block root is selected, and then in the properties here we're going to click edit block properties, which will bring up this menu here for inputs and outputs. If you hit this plus button here, we can add a new input which we're going to call iris color A, and the type is set as number right now, but we can switch that over here to color because it's the color, and we can leave the default value as it is because we'll be changing that in the actual project. And then we can add an output and repeat the process. So iris color A, and change the type from number to color, leave the default value as it is. And now if we back out of this, you'll see we now have an input and an output for our iris color A. So now if we hit save on this block and come back over to the project, you'll notice immediately that we now have a new output here, iris color A, which we can connect up to this color here. It doesn't actually do anything, so we can change the color here and it has no effect just yet, but that's because we need to add a few patches over here. So if we take the block root and drag it into our patch editor, and then where the output is here, we can see and then where this output is, you can see we can make a patch. So make a patch for this iris color A and connect it from iris color A output here to the input of our new patch. Now hit save again on this block so that it updates in the main project, and then we'll head back over there, and if we connect it up now, then you'll see that the color will change as I change it in this input section. So I'll make it blue just so it stands out, and there it is. So now inside of this block here we are editing this color, which is affecting this eyeball shader, and all of that's being done through the block which we've created and are editing over here. So now we can do the same thing for the iris colors B and C. Okay, so we now have iris colors A, B and C set to be inputs, type color with the default value unchanged, and the same for our outputs. So now if we back out of here, you'll see our outputs here on the block root. I can hit save and we come back over here and you'll notice that we now have those same outputs over here. What we have to do is connect up those patches again. So iris colors C, B and A, make sure that they're all plugged in over here in your block. hit save, and then when we come over here, we can connect these 3 outputs to these 3 inputs. So now, our eyes should look grey other than this one here, until we change them inside of here. So you'll see now I can change this to red, and I can change iris color C to something like this, and you'll see how it's starting to come together. Okay, so next up is the iris opacity. So if we come back over to our block root, we can edit the properties, add a new input, and we can rename this one iris opacity. This will be left as a number. We're going to change the input limit to both, and the input style from text input to slider. So this one's going to be a sliding scale. Our default value will be 1, so that it's fully visible at the start. Our minimum value will be 0, and our max value will be 1. So when the slider is all the way down to 0, the opacity will be essentially invisible, and when it's at 1, it will be fully visible. Now we can create an output for the same thing. So output iris opacity, and just recreate that. Leave it as a number, change the input limit to both, input style to slider, and the default value to 1, with the minimum value at 0 and the max value at 1. So now we have that output here. We can create a patch for it. You can already see the sliding scale, so we can connect that up, and it's now affected by this block root. So if we hit save, come back over here and connect the iris opacity here to this, now you see this sliding scale here affects the opacity of our irises in the scene. Okay, next up is the pupil color, which is exactly the same as the iris colors that we've already created. So we'll do a pupil color and change the number to color. We can set the default value for pupils to be black because it's just simpler, and then do the same thing for an output, and there it is, a pupil color output. So we can add a patch, connect that up, and hit save. And now when we go back over here, we can connect up the pupil color, which by default is black, but now we have the option to change that inside of our scene. We can create some nice blue pupils if you want, give it a little bit of a robotic look, and there you go. The pupil opacity is the same as the iris opacity, so we can go back into block properties, add a new input, and rename this pupil opacity, but the settings will be exactly the same as they were for the iris. So we'll leave it as a number, set the input limit to both, input style to slider, default value to 1, minimum to 0, and maximum value to 1. And now we'll just create the same thing as an output, and there we go. So now when we click out, we'll have this with the patch, the slider's already there, so all we have to do is connect it up. So I mean, this is actually not that complicated once you get the hang of it. It's just about automating these inputs here so you don't have to create a whole bunch of patches and interactions yourself to manage them. So now we can connect the pupil opacity here and create a sliding scale that allows us to make them invisible or visible depending on what we want. All the rest of these are pretty much the same thing. So the scalera color is going to be a color, just the same as these ones. And the opacity and scales here will all be numbers with the exact same settings as we've already created. So I'll skip forwards so that I have all of those inside of this block, and then I'll come back once that's done. Okay, so I've added in the rest of the outputs here. I'm just going to connect them all up. So we have our scalera color, we have our scalera opacity, our iris scale, pupil scale, the global scale, which affects the scale of the entire object, and then the global opacity, which is the same thing. It affects the entire object's opacity. So now if we look down the side here, you'll see we have all these inputs, and we can adjust them as we see fit. So I can pull this all the way down to 0, and it will make everything completely invisible. I can bring it back up to 1. Same with the scale. We can start shrinking down the size of these things and give them a pretty weird look. I'll just show you quickly over here. This is what it looks like now. All of our inputs and outputs are down the side. Our outputs have been turned into patches here and connected up to our block root. If I look inside the block properties, you'll see we have all of our inputs listed here. The scalera color is a color which I set to be white by default because the scalera is the white part of your eye. But you can change the default color to anything you like. The opacity is, like I said, a number, and it has the same settings as the previous opacities that we've created for iris and pupil. Same with scale, pupil scale, global scale, opacity. They're all exactly the same on the inputs and on the outputs as well. So once we've got all this here, all you need to do is make sure it's saved, and then it will update over here. Connect them up the way I just did to your inputs on the eyeball shader. Make sure your eyeball material texture is connected as an output, and now we have all of these here, and we're pretty much good to go. Now, like I said earlier, creating these blocks is a little bit labor intensive up front, but once you have them in place, it's designed to simplify the process. So you can take this now, for example, having saved this project, I can open it up here. I'll show you that we now have a folder here for the blocks that we've made. And inside of that we have this .ar block file, which we can now take and drag inside of any project, including the one we've just created. We can drag it again inside of our assets panel, and it creates a duplicate of what we've got already. And now we can take that and drag it inside of our patch editor again to create exactly the same thing that we've spent all that time making without having to do it again manually. So now we can copy and paste this eyeball shader, for example. And if we wanted to add a second face maybe, then we could do that. We could connect each of these up, have a separate eyeballs texture. Maybe when you tap to change, it creates a different variation. And we could have as many of these as we wanted in one project, or export it, have that little block that we've made, and import it into any project that you want to use eyeball shaders for. So this will save you a lot of time in the future. One final thing we can do is to create patches from these inputs. So if, for example, we wanted to change the global opacity, we could create a patch for that. And you can see the slider is in here now. We can adjust it manually. It's a little bit laggy on my computer, but you'll see I can reduce the opacity to 0, I can increase it to 1. And what I can add here is, for example, a loop animation, which I can connect from progress here to a transition. And because it's a number, we want to convert this from vector 3 to a number. And we've already set our range to be 0 to 1. So the start range here is 0 and the end is 1. So if we connect that up, then what you'll see is over the course of 1 second that this will transition from a range of 0 to 1, meaning that we go from 0 opacity to fully visible. And you can change the duration of this, for example, to 7.5 seconds, so half of a story. And if you mirror it, then what it will do is it will go from 0 to 1 and then all the way back down to 0 again over the course of a 15-second Instagram story. So there's a lot to play around with here, and I hope that some of it's been useful. I'll zoom out quickly and give you a sense of everything we've been working on. This is the patch graph. These are all the elements that we used in our scene. Make it a little bit larger for you to see everything. And I'll pull up the block one more time just so you can see that. So if you want to take screen grabs or check it out in your own time. But yeah, hopefully this was helpful to some of you. I'm sorry if the video was a bit rambly. I know it's almost 30 minutes long. This was not necessarily the most complicated thing to explain, but I've definitely had some computer troubles while doing this. If you check the clock in the top right corner, you'll see that I started recording this on Saturday morning and it's now Monday morning. So yeah, that might be a fun little Easter egg for some of you to see what times I was actually recording this video. But let me know in the comments what you thought of it. Leave a like if you enjoyed it. If you want me to make more breakdowns of the template packages, then I'm more than happy to do that. If you have any other ideas for videos you want to see, let me know. And don't forget to share this wherever you think it might be useful for someone. I'll catch you in the next one, and peace.